Well, yesterday I began looking at verse 33, and then I kind of went off on a tangent, which my wife often points out to me that once I start talking about a subject, I tend to take the long route rather than the short route. I apologize if that distracts you. It's just kind of the way I'm wired. But getting back to what Solomon said in verse 33, he said that the Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked. And again, we have to identify who are the wicked. Who fits into that category? I think that every one of us, even the wicked people, don't see themselves as wicked. And that's really where wickedness can become quite deceptive, because what it simply means is being hostile towards God. In other words, you're moving in a way that's away from God, not towards God. You're moving into things that God says don't touch, and you're touching those things. You're embracing thoughts and ideas and goals and objectives that will lead you further and further away from the place where God created you to be at peace. And so he says, essentially, there's a curse on the house of people who live in that way, who disregard what God has to say and just kind of doing their own thing. And it's not so much that God says, I'm cursing you, but rather he's just simply said there is a dynamic of the universe that every cause will have a result. Everything that I do, that we call the cause and effect of reality, that if I do one thing, it's going to cause something else to happen someplace else. It's the ripple effect of everyday life. And if the ripples of my life are creating waves that really are not in my best interest, I will find myself reaping the consequences. I mean, I often think about it because all the time it pops in the news now that many of the famous rock and roll artists of my day who live by that philosophy, live fast and die young and make a good-looking corpse, they basically, it was drug, sex, and rock and roll. And what I'm finding is so many of them look really old when they're younger than I am, and they often end life much sooner than I have lived. And so I look at that and I say, how much of that is really the consequence of choices that they made? You know, many people do come to an awareness. I think about Alice Cooper. I was watching Greg Laurie interview him recently, and it really struck me how he was talking about how that he was a drug addict and alcoholic, and then he said he realized what he was doing to his life. He realized that he was basically killing himself. And, you know, I mean, he looks like he's been down, 100 miles of rough road. But the reality is that he's still alive and he's still functioning, and God is using him. And I look at those kind of redemptive stories and I think to myself that it's not so much that you're cursed by God and that's it. But he says basically there is a way that is the way of those who curse themselves. And that's the thing that, a curse that has no basis, Proverbs will later on say, never really has an effect. When somebody curses you and says, I hope that the worst of this happens to you. Well, if that's not from God, that's never going to happen. But at the same time, we can go the way that brings cursing into our lives. And so he says, if you're that person, you'll find that your house will not be blessed. You look at your house, and it's interesting that how the text here in the NIV makes this contrast between a house and a home. I mean, we often talk about the difference between a house and a home. A house is a building, and a very useful building to protect you from the weather and to keep you safe from intruders and all the rest of those sorts of things. But a home implies something very different. It doesn't describe so much what happens on the outside or the structure. It describes what's going on inside the structure. And a home implies this place of warmth and safety and affirmation, in truthfulness and honesty and all those kind of things, a transparency of life that makes us all happier when we live in a transparent life. And he says, basically, there's a choice that people make and they don't realize what the long-term implications are of those choices. And so he's really beginning by starting with this concept. He said, when you choose righteousness, and righteousness means by living in right relationship with God. When you make the decision that, God, I want to live in right relationship with you, then he says what you'll find is that God will bless your life. There's this divine favor that comes upon your life, that you'll find that you're going in a pathway that leads to upward enjoyment and pleasure, not downward discouragement and depression. And he says, that's a simple decision, but it's the choice that we make in regards to our life. And you see, a lot of people, they don't like to think of their choices as being something they choose. When we go and buy into what we call the victim mentality, the idea that my life is where it's at because somebody else failed me in some major way. What we're essentially saying is we had no choice, or we're saying that the things that were against me were so great that I had no way to defend myself. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations like that. If you grew up in a severely abusive home, if you are in a situation like the Jews were during the Holocaust and they were just being imprisoned and enslaved and murdered and so forth, they were true victims. That's what the term victim has been, is a person who has no control over the evil that's being done to them. But most of us don't qualify for victim status. I mean, even if we had a rough start, and all of us to some degree had one, it's all a matter of proportion, I suppose, but all of us had parents who were sinners, and they gave birth to kids who are also sinners, and we grew up in a sinful world, and to some degree or another, every one of us has been marked by that reality. We've suffered soul damage because of that exposure to sinful parents and living in a sinful world, and we had sinful friends, and we ourselves made some sinful choices. And that really is the one thing that we control. You can't control your parents. You can't change the way the world is, despite some people's efforts to create nirvana on earth. But what you can control is how you respond to those things. And that's a choice. Resentment is a choice to hold on to a hurt long beyond any necessity to do so. In other words, that we're carrying this hurt inside of us. In fact, I wrote a blog one time, I called it Hoarding Our Hurts, where we're really kind of like the people who are hoarders, where they keep all sorts of stuff in their house that they should throw away. Stuff that they don't need, stuff that doesn't help them, but they hang on to it for some emotional need in their life. And oftentimes people hold on to their resentments, and if they do, then they become bitter. It becomes a root that goes down into the very being, and they often liken it to the old man who's screaming at kids who are running across his lawn, get off my lawn, those kind of people, they're filled with resentment and bitter, and they're angry about the circumstances their lives have come to. And eventually, if they're able, that will really metastasize into maliciousness, that will actually do and say things that are purposely, intentionally harmful to other people. So there's this trajectory that is called the life of misery, that we start off being resentful and we hoard those resentments. We hang on to them. And then those resentments become bitter roots in our life that eventually defiles our entire being. And we become people who are looking for revenge. We're looking to get even. We're looking to settle a score. The bottom line is that vengeance, God said, is mine. He's the only one who is righteousness enough to judge something. And one of the things I discovered several years ago that's been helpful for me is that whatever humbles me helps me, and whatever hurts me eventually works to heal me. And so if you're like me, you try to avoid humbling experiences in your life. You try to avoid certainly the hurtful things. None of us likes to be humbled. And being humbled is one of the most hurtful things you can go through in your life. And yet, there's something profound about it. Even when he talks about the blessing of the poor, there's something about poverty. And believe me, I'm not talking out of school when I talk about poverty. There were many years in my wife and I's life where we certainly qualified for being in poverty. We were way below the middle class level. And yet we didn't know that we had it bad, because we were so involved in what we were doing for the Lord, and recognized that we were in this place because God had placed us there. He put us in that situation, that circumstance. When I think about people who purposely go into ministry and they go into the mission field, and I was just reading a fascinating blog of a gentleman who had purposely been called by God to a very impoverished community and that couldn't support him, and he really had to depend upon outside support. That's here in the United States, when he was living in one of the wealthiest places in the country, and yet here was this pocket of poverty. And God called him to the pocket of poverty. And it was so interesting because he was talking about how God used that in his life and how God built grace into his life through that whole experience. And that's where James says, the poor in this world who are rich in faith towards God. That my wife and I learned that prayer gets answered by God when you ask him, because as David said, I was young and now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous impoverished or begging for bread. I mean, it's this wonderful thing that God says, I'll take care of you. I'll give you your daily bread. And literally the translation of that phrase, daily bread, literally means that every day God will have provided in advance for what you need. That as you reach each station in your journey, what you need will be there to continue your journey to the next step. And you see, most of us have kind of been fortified in this idea that we have to have so many millions of dollars in order to retire comfortably. Well, I'm not saying that's not true. But I'm also saying that there are many of us who have never been in a position where we're able to do that. And when you find that you're having to make those decisions of saying, God, we need to have you provide on our daily bread, provide for our monthly needs, or whatever it is, that God recognizes that and honors that. As Tevye said in Fiddle in the Roof, he said, I know that, the great riches is a cursing, but he said, couldn't you curse me a little? And we've all been there. We've all thought and felt like that. But the simple reality is that God says, when you decide to follow me, you're walking in the path of blessing. And when you decide not to seek me with all of your heart and go where I call you and do what I've called you to do, you'll find that what that'll invite is the paths of the cursed. Not that God is purposely impacting you, but what he is, he's removed his protection and grace and blessing from you. Well, let me continue on with this conversation tomorrow. God bless you.